I've debated sharing this story for a long time. Being Cherokee, I've always been taught that the land holds secrets, some beautiful, some terrifying. My ancestors lived in harmony with the land, understanding its power and respecting its dangers. But there are places where the land doesn't want people, places where you're not supposed to go, no matter how curious you are. One of those places is the canyon near my family's home. Growing up, my grandfather used to tell us stories about the canyon. It wasn't far from our house, just a couple of miles past the tree line, but we were always warned to stay away. He'd say that the canyon was old, older than we could understand, and that it held things that weren't meant for us. It was a sacred place, he'd say, but also a place of danger. In Cherokee culture, we have stories about spirits that live in the mountains and forests. Some good, some bad. The canyon, though, was different. My grandfather said it was a place where the Yunwi-Tsunsti, the little people, once lived. They were ancient beings, older than humans, and though they could be kind to those who respected them, they could also be vengeful if disturbed. But there were other things in the canyon too. Darker, more dangerous things. I never paid much attention to the warnings when I was a kid. The canyon was just another part of the land to me, a place I wasn't allowed to go, but a place I was always curious about. My cousins and I would sometimes sneak close to it, daring each other to get closer, but we never went in. Not until one summer when I was about 16. That's when everything changed. It was late August, right before school started up again. My cousin and I were bored, restless, and too stubborn to listen to the stories anymore. We'd heard the warnings our whole lives, but nothing had ever actually happened, so we decided to go. We wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Looking back, it was probably the dumbest decision I've ever made, but back then, it felt like an adventure. We set out early in the morning, taking only what we needed: water, snacks, and our phones, though there was no service that far out. The hike to the canyon wasn't long, and by noon we were standing at the edge of it, staring down into the rocky chasm below. The canyon itself wasn't particularly large, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The air was different there, heavier, and the wind made a strange whistling sound as it passed through the rocks. We stood there for a while, just looking. I remember feeling a strange sense of unease, like we were being watched. But my cousin, always the braver one, laughed it off and started making his way down the narrow path that led into the canyon. I followed, though every instinct in my body told me to turn back. As we descended, the temperature dropped, even though the sun was still high in the sky. It was like stepping into another world. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind. Just silence. When we reached the bottom, that's when things started to get strange. At first it was subtle. Shadows that seemed to move in the corners of my vision. The feeling of something brushing against my skin, even though there was nothing there. My cousin didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. We walked deeper into the canyon, our footsteps echoing off the stone walls, until we reached a small clearing where the ground was covered in strange carvings. Symbols, spirals, and figures that looked like people, but distorted, twisted. I bent down to get a closer look, and that's when I heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, like the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't a language I recognized, but it was unmistakably human, like voices speaking just out of earshot. I looked at my cousin to see if he heard it too, but he was standing completely still, staring at something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw it. At the far end of the clearing, partially hidden in the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its body was wrapped in darkness. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic, like it was trying to tell us something, trying to warn us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, and that's when the smell hit me. Rotting flesh, like something long dead but still moving. My cousin, who had been silent the whole time, suddenly snapped out of his trance and bolted. He didn't say a word, didn't look back, just ran. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and followed, my feet slipping on the loose rocks as I scrambled to get out of there. The whispering followed us, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. It wasn't just voices anymore, it was screams, cries of pain and terror. I could feel something chasing us, something unseen but very real. The air around us felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, like the canyon itself was trying to pull me back. We finally made it to the top, breathless and covered in sweat, but the moment we crossed the threshold out of the canyon, the whispering stopped. The air felt lighter, the world brighter, but we didn't stop running until we were miles away. We never spoke about what happened after that. My cousin refused to talk about it, and eventually, we just stopped hanging out altogether. He moved away a few years later, and I haven't seen him since. I've asked around the community about the canyon, but no one will talk about it. It's like they know, but they don't want to say. I haven't been back to the canyon, and I don't plan to. Whatever's down there, it's not something that belongs in this world. It's old, ancient, and angry, and it's waiting. So, if you ever find yourself near a place that feels wrong, that feels like the air is heavier, or like the land itself is watching you, turn around, leave. There are places on this earth that don't belong to us, places that hold the weight of centuries, and they don't want to be disturbed. The canyon is one of those places. I don't know why I'm telling this story now. Maybe it's because I've never been able to shake the memory of what happened, or maybe it's because I feel like someone needs to know. I've kept it to myself for years, but after what I've experienced as a guide and park ranger in the southwestern desert, there's no doubt in my mind that some things are just beyond explanation. I'm Navajo, and I've spent most of my life on or near the reservation, surrounded by the desert and the towering red rock canyons that dominate this part of the world. It's a beautiful place, but it's also a land that demands respect. The desert can be harsh, unforgiving, and full of stories that our people have been telling for generations. Stories about creatures that walk the land at night, spirits that inhabit the canyons, and forces that don't take kindly to strangers. I used to think those stories were just that, stories, but not anymore. It was about 6 years ago, and I was working as a guide, leading a group of tourists on a multi-day hike through one of the lesser-known canyons in the area. The canyon was remote, a maze of towering cliffs and narrow passages that twisted and turned for miles. It wasn't a place you'd find in guidebooks, and only a handful of locals knew the trails. That's why I loved it. It was untouched, wild, and you could go days without seeing another soul. The tourists were a group of 5, an older couple, 2 guys in their 30s, and a young woman who looked like she was fresh out of college. They'd hired me to take them deep into the desert, to camp under the stars and see the real landscape, away from the crowded parks and tourist traps. We started off just fine. Everyone was in good spirits, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm days, and cool nights. On the 3rd day of the trip, we reached a part of the canyon that even I wasn't too familiar with. It was an isolated area, with steep walls on either side, and the path ahead narrowed into a tight passageway that we would have to squeeze through. The group was eager to keep exploring, so we pressed on. By late afternoon, we made camp in a small clearing near the base of a rock face that loomed over us like a giant sentinel. That night, after dinner, we all sat around the campfire, telling stories and listening to the sounds of the desert. The coyotes howled in the distance, and the stars were so bright you could almost feel their weight pressing down on you. The young woman, Sarah, asked me about the local legends, specifically about skinwalkers. She'd heard bits and pieces about them and wanted to know if they were real. I smiled, trying to brush it off, but deep down, I felt a twinge of discomfort. Skinwalkers are not something we talk about lightly. Among the Navajo, they are shapeshifters, witches who can transform into animals, using dark magic to do harm. My grandfather always said that even speaking about them too much could attract their attention. So, I gave Sarah the short version of the story, told her it was best not to think too much about it, and left it at that. The fire eventually died down, and everyone turned in for the night. I stayed up for a while, watching the embers and listening to the quiet of the desert. Something about the canyon felt off that night, like the air was too still, the silence too complete. But I figured it was just my nerves, spooked by Sarah's talk of skinwalkers. I wish that was all it had been. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. At first, I thought it was one of the tourists getting up to use the bathroom, but then I heard a strange noise, a sort of scraping, shuffling sound, like something was dragging across the rocks. I sat up, straining to hear, but the noise stopped. That's when I heard Sarah scream. I bolted out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and ran toward her tent, heart pounding. The others were already outside, confused and terrified. Sarah's tent was open, but she wasn't inside. We called her name, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no response. Just the silence of the canyon and the faint echoes of our own voices bouncing off the walls. I started looking for tracks, hoping she'd just wandered off, but what I found sent chills down my spine. There were tracks, all right, but they weren't human. They were large, too large for any animal I knew of, and they looked like they had been made by something walking on two legs with long claws dragging behind. I tried to stay calm, to keep the group from panicking, but I knew we weren't alone out there. Something had taken her. I told everyone to stay close, to keep their flashlights on, and we began searching the immediate area. We combed through the brush and around the rock formations, but there was no sign of her. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. The others were starting to freak out, and I could feel the fear rising in my chest. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew we were dealing with something unnatural. Something I had heard about my whole life, but never thought I'd encounter. We searched for hours, but by dawn, we still hadn't found Sarah. I made the decision to head back to the ranger station to report her missing. The others were shaken, and I had to keep telling them we'd find her, that she was probably just lost. But I didn't believe it. I knew better. As we packed up camp, I noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing, where the ground met the canyon wall. There, etched into the stone, were strange symbols. Markings I didn't recognize, but they looked old, ancient, like something from another time. I did mention it to the others, but I took a picture with my phone. We hiked out of the canyon that day, and I radioed the rangers as soon as we were within range. Search teams were sent out, and for the next 3 days they scoured the area. Helicopters, dogs, everything. But there was no trace of Sarah. It was like she had been swallowed by the desert. Officially, they called it a missing person case. But I know what happened. Something took her. Something from the old stories, from the legends my grandfather used to warn me about. I don't know if it was a skinwalker or something else, but whatever it was, it's still out there. I haven't gone back to that canyon since. I still work in the park, still guide tourists, but I avoid that area like the plague. And I don't tell people about the skinwalkers anymore. Not because I don't believe, but because I do. If you ever find yourself out in the desert, especially in those deep, narrow canyons, be careful. Stay on the trails, and if you hear something strange at night, something that doesn't belong, don't investigate. Don't go looking for the source. Because in those canyons, in that silence, you might just find it. Or worse, it might find you. I've been a park ranger for over 12 years now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things while patrolling the parks. But there's one experience I can't explain away, no matter how many times I replay it in my mind. It happened 5 years ago, deep in Black Canyon, one of the most remote and least visited areas of the park. I've never talked about it publicly, until now. Black Canyon isn't on most maps, and that's by design. It's one of those places that just feels wrong. The trees grow thicker there, and the wildlife is scarce. Even the wind doesn't sound right as it moves through the canyon. It whistles in a way that makes your skin crawl. Most of the other rangers avoid it, and visitors almost never find their way there. Those who do usually don't stay long. That year, we had a handful of tourists report strange noises and sightings near the canyon, but nothing serious enough to investigate. Just the usual. Odd animal calls at night, strange lights flickering through the trees, and a few people claiming to have seen shadows moving at the edge of their camp. Most of it could be explained by the isolation, fear of the dark, or just nerves. One evening in early autumn, I got called to investigate a missing person report near Black Canyon. A couple had gone hiking earlier that day and were supposed to check in with the ranger station by sundown. When they didn't show up, we sent a team to search for them. By nightfall, I was the only one left still looking. Everyone else had turned back, figuring they might have just taken a wrong turn and would show up in the morning. I took a small trail that led deep into Black Canyon, hoping I'd find them before the temperature dropped too low. The forest was dense, and the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The sun had set completely by then, and the only light came from my flashlight. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at the sky, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. Just off the trail, there was a small clearing, and in the middle of it, something had torn up the ground. The earth was disturbed, like it had been dug up in a frenzy. The strange part was the way the trees around the clearing had been scratched, deep gouges running along their trunks, as if something massive had been dragging claws across them. I've seen bear marks before, but these weren't from any bear I knew. The marks were too wide, too deep. I called out into the darkness, hoping the missing hikers might hear me, but the only response I got was silence. Complete, dead silence. No animals, no wind, not even the rustling of leaves. Just that thick, oppressive quiet that made my skin crawl. A low, guttural growl echoed from deeper within the canyon. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. It was deeper, more primal, and it reverberated through the trees like it was coming from all around me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, scanning the forest with my flashlight. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my light, something moved. At first it looked like a shadow, tall, dark, and looming, but as it stepped closer, I could see more. Its body was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in matted fur that looked almost black in the faint light. Its limbs were long, unnaturally so, with hands that ended in sharp, claw-like fingers. But the worst part was its face. It wasn't an animal. Its face was disturbingly human, but twisted, deformed. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of my flashlight, and its mouth was lined with jagged, uneven teeth, too big for its face. It stared at me, unblinking, its breath steaming in the cold night air. I bolted down the trail, my heart hammering in my chest, barely able to keep my footing as I navigated the twisting path. Behind me, I could hear it following, its heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, I might freeze, and that would be the end. The growling grew louder, closer, and I could feel the ground tremble beneath my feet as it gained on me. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Somehow, I made it back to the main trailhead where my truck was parked. I dove inside, slamming the door behind me, and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't stop to catch my breath until I was speeding down the dirt road, leaving Black Canyon far behind. The next morning, I reported what had happened, but I kept the details vague. Missing hikers, strange sounds, possible animal attack, that's all I told them. I didn't mention the creature. Who would believe me? It sounded insane. A giant humanoid beast in the middle of a national park? I'd be laughed out of my job. The couple was never found. No bodies, no gear, no signs of struggle. Just gone, like they'd vanished into thin air. The official report said they must have gotten lost, fallen into a ravine, or succumbed to the elements. But I know better. Something lives in Black Canyon. Something that's been there far longer than us, hiding in the shadows, watching anyone who dares to wander too deep. I haven't gone back to that part of the park since. I avoid it, and I warn visitors to steer clear of it too, though I never tell them the real reason why. So, if you ever find yourself hiking near Black Canyon, and the air feels too still, or the trees seem too quiet, turn back. Don't keep going. Because there's something in those woods, something that doesn't want to be found.